Nothing could have prepared him for the moment. A small voice opened the door and shattered the quiet evening he expected. The boy looked up with a bright smile and a trust so deep it froze him in place, as if the world suddenly revealed a truth he was never meant to escape. The mother hurried toward them, her steps uneven as worry flashed across her face, and in that instant the air thickened with questions no one wanted to ask. How many years of silence can break in a single breath? Can a child's simple word reopen a past two adults tried so hard to bury? He watched the boy cling to the edge of the doorway with a joy he did not understand. Yet his heart pounded with a fear he could not hide. The mother and the man locked eyes, and old wounds rose between them like shadows returning home. He did not know what to say, and she did not know how to breathe. The moment stretched tight, trembling with everything left unsaid, until she softly whispered his name and everything began to crack. The room felt too small for the storm that followed. He tried to steady his breathing while she avoided his eyes, both trapped in a moment neither knew how to explain. The boy moved around with ease, unaware of the weight hanging above the adults who watched each other with memories they wished they could forget. Every second carried the echo of a past that refused to stay buried, pressing against the walls like a secret fighting to break free. He wondered if this was the moment everything would fall apart again, while she wondered if she had made a mistake letting him in at all. Yet the child's laughter filled the air with a softness that made the truth even harder to hold back, reminding them both that innocence notices everything, even when it understands nothing. He tried to speak, but the words tangled with the years lodged in his throat. She moved carefully around the kitchen, pretending to focus on dishes that did not need cleaning, her hands trembling just enough to betray her calm. The boy hummed softly as he arranged his toys, unaware that every small sound seemed to pull the adults back to a time when their friendship had been their only anchor. Silence became a wall neither dared to break, each waiting for the other to be brave first. The past sat between them like a shadow that remembered every choice, every silence, every moment that changed everything. If truth could burn, this was the flame. When she finally turned to face him, her voice trembled with more than worry. The years had carved something fragile inside her, something he recognized because it mirrored the guilt he carried. The boy glanced up at them, sensing a tension he could not name, and for a moment the entire room felt suspended in air. He wanted to ask why the boy called him that word. She wanted to ask why he came back now. Both questions burned behind tight breaths, but neither dared to speak them. The weight of the unspoken pressed between them, heavy as truth and sharper than memory. The tension reached a breaking point when the boy wandered over and stood between them, holding out a small toy, as if offering peace. The simple gesture struck deeper than any words, forcing them to confront the truth they had tried so long to avoid. He felt the ground shift beneath him, realizing this moment carried the weight of years lost and choices never faced. She watched him with guarded eyes, unsure whether to shield her child or let him discover the hope she once believed in. The room held its breath as past and present collided, leaving them with no place left to hide. Whatever came next would change everything. The silence that followed dinner preparations felt heavier than the night outside, like every unsaid truth was pacing the room, waiting to be acknowledged. He sat on the edge of the couch, pretending to focus on the framed drawings on the wall, but his thoughts drifted back to the moment the boy called him a name he had no right to hear. She moved quietly through the kitchen, her steps slow and deliberate, as if she feared any sudden sound might shatter what little calm remained. The boy hummed softly while coloring at the table, unaware that his single word had shaken the ground beneath two adults who once depended on each other more than they ever admitted. The weight of old wounds hovered in every breath, pushing them toward conversations they had avoided for years. And as he finally looked up and saw her watching him from the doorway, he knew the past was no longer content to stay buried. He tried to steady his breath as memories slipped back into his mind. The nights he once promised he would always be there. The mornings he disappeared without explanation. the silence that stretched between them for years. She placed a cup of tea on the table with hands that trembled despite her best attempt to hide it, and he felt guilt rise like a tide he could no longer outrun. The boy's quiet presence only deepened the ache, reminding him of all the moments he never knew existed. She glanced at him with a look that carried hurt and history, one that forced him to confront the truth he had avoided for far too long. Nothing about this moment was simple, and yet it felt like the only place where the truth could finally breathe. She finally sat across from him, folding her hands together as if bracing herself for a storm she had survived once before. He waited, unsure whether to speak first or give her the space she clearly fought to claim. The boy played on the floor with small cars, their soft clacks filling the room like a reminder of innocence too pure to mix with the heaviness settling in the air. When she finally raised her eyes to meet his, the years between them collapsed in an instant, bringing back 1,000 moments they never talked about. He wanted to apologize, but even the word felt too small to hold everything he should have said back then. She took a shallow breath, steadying the emotions rising in her voice, and he felt the gravity of the moment as if the entire room leaned in to listen. The tension thickened as she began to speak, her voice soft but weighted with years she carried alone. She didn't mention details yet, only fragments of nights she cried quietly, so her son wouldn't hear. In mornings she gathered every piece of strength just to keep going. He listened without interruption, the guilt settling deeper with every word she allowed herself to release. The boy crawled closer and leaned against her leg, instinctively sensing a tremor in her tone, and she placed a gentle hand on his hair to steady herself. He watched the small gesture and felt the truth he had avoided for so long pressing down on him with unbearable clarity. Whatever happened back then, it had shaped the life of the child before him. And that realization hit harder than anything she could have said outright. She paused, gathering the courage to say the words she had guarded for years, and he felt his stomach twist in anticipation of the truth he knew he deserved to hear. The room fell unbelievably quiet, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the child's slow breathing against her side. She finally admitted how his disappearance had left her stranded in the darkest moment of her life, and though she did not yet reveal why it mattered so deeply, the pain in her voice told him everything he needed to know. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of her confession settle, understanding that this was only the beginning of the truth she needed to share. The boy looked between them with innocent confusion, sensing something fragile hanging in the air. And as she lifted her gaze toward him, he knew the next words would cut even deeper. The truth hovered between them like a door half open, daring them to push it the rest of the way. He waited with a tightness in his chest, knowing she was finally ready to speak the words she had swallowed for years. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had carried her child through nights of fear and loneliness, and he felt the weight of everything she had endured without him. Matteo played with a quiet focus on the rug, unaware that the world of the adults above him was shifting with every breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but shaking beneath the surface, revealing how he once stood by her during the worst storm of her life, only to vanish when she needed him most. He felt the memory cut deeper than he expected, as if hearing it aloud made the past impossible to ignore. And as she lifted her eyes to his, he knew this was the beginning of truths neither of them could run from anymore. She spoke slowly, recounting the days when everything in her world had fallen apart, and he had been the only person who stayed long enough to help her breathe again. He remembered pieces of it. The late-night calls, the frantic fear in her voice, the way she clung to hope even when it seemed impossible. But hearing her describe it now felt like reliving a mistake he couldn't undo. Matteo hummed softly as he drew on a crumpled sheet of paper, the gentle sound grounding her even as her voice cracked with memories she once tried to bury. He felt a hollow ache settle in his chest, realizing how deeply his absence had shaped her journey into motherhood. She didn't blame him aloud, but the silence after her words carried the weight of everything she couldn't say, and he understood that some wounds don't fade, They simply learned to live inside the people who survived them. When he finally found the courage to speak, his voice trembled with regret that had lived inside him for longer than he cared to admit. He explained how fear and confusion had driven him away, how he convinced himself she would be better off without someone who was falling apart in his own life. She listened, her expression unreadable, absorbing each word as if weighing its truth against the pain she carried. Mateo crawled closer with his toy in hand, settling near her feet as if sensing the vulnerability rising in the room. He felt the sting of seeing her like this, strong yet exhausted, forgiving yet wounded, and wondered how different life might have been if he had stayed. For the first time, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a space waiting to be rebuilt. But neither knew whether the foundation beneath them was strong enough to hold the truth. Her breath shook as she finally revealed the hardest part. The moment she learned she was pregnant and realized she had no one left to lean on. The memory still lived sharp in her voice, and he felt the words hit him with a force that emptied the air around them. She told him how she used to sit awake at night wishing he were still there, not because she couldn't survive without him, but because he had once promised she wouldn't have to. Mateo crawled into her lap, resting his head against her chest in an instinctive attempt to comfort her, and she held him close as if anchoring herself to the only constant she ever had. He lowered his gaze, unable to face the truth of how deep his absence had cut. For the first time, he realized the story of her strength was also the story of his failure. As her words settled into the stillness of the room, he felt something shift deep inside, a realization that the damage he left behind was far greater than he had ever understood. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at him with a mixture of exhaustion and courage, as if deciding whether the man before her was the same one who left all those years ago. Mateo lifted his toy toward Daniel with a curious smile, unaware that his small gesture carried more forgiveness than either adult could offer themselves. The moment hung delicately, trembling between pain and possibility, and he felt a spark of hope flicker beneath his remorse. She let out a slow breath, not yet forgiving him, but no longer shutting him out. The truth had finally been spoken, and now they stood at the quiet edge of what might come next, healing or breaking all over again. The room felt tighter as the weight of everything finally surfaced, pushing them into a silence that vibrated with emotions neither could hide anymore. She stood near the counter, gripping its edge as if steadying herself against memories that refused to stay in the past. He watched her with regret burning in his chest, wishing he could take back every moment she faced alone. Mateo played softly with his cars, occasionally glancing up with the quiet intuition only a child carries. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp with the raw honesty she'd held back for years, telling him how abandonment carves deeper than most people ever admit. He felt each word like a blow he knew he deserved, unable to escape the truth of what he had done. And in that moment, their unspoken resentment finally began to take shape, pressing them toward the breaking point they both knew was coming. Her voice rose without warning, not in anger, but in pain, as she finally allowed herself to say the words she once held behind closed doors. She described the nights when fear wrapped around her like a second skin, when the world felt too heavy and she had to be strong because no one else would be. He listened, unable to defend himself because every word she said was a truth he had left behind. Mateo paused his play and looked up at them, sensing the storm in her voice and the guilt in his silence. She wiped at her eyes, frustrated that emotion still found its way through even after all these years. He stepped closer, but the distance between them felt wider than ever. And as she continued to speak, he realized this wasn't just a confrontation. It was everything she had carried alone finally demanding to be heard. He finally broke the silence with a voice that cracked under the weight of his own guilt, admitting how deeply he had failed her, how fear had made him run when he should have stayed. She looked at him with a mix of disbelief and hurt, as if hearing the truth from his own lips only made the wound sting sharper. Mateo clutched a small toy and scooted closer to her leg, drawn by the tremble in her breath. Daniel felt a heavy ache spread through him, realizing the cost of every choice he made without thinking of its consequences. She took a step back, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of everything he confessed, unsure whether his regret was enough to reshape what had already been broken. The moment crackled with years of emotions finally colliding, leaving them breathless and exposed. Their voices rose, not shouting but filled with a desperate need to be understood. She told him how his disappearance had forced her to grow stronger than she ever wanted to be, and he told her how running away destroyed more than he ever realized. The air between them pulsed with grief, anger, love, and something fragile neither could name. Mateo watched them with wide, uncertain eyes, sensing the fear in the air, but not understanding the history behind it. She pressed a hand to her forehead, overwhelmed by emotions she thought she had already survived long ago. He looked at her as if seeing the full weight of her journey for the first time. And for the first time since he walked through her door, they stood face to face with the truth neither could keep buried. She finally stepped away from him, needing space to breathe, while he remained rooted to the floor, afraid that moving might shatter whatever fragile connection remained between them. Mateo followed her quietly, placing a small hand on her arm, as if trying to shield her from the storm he didn't understand. She forced a shaky breath and looked back at Daniel with eyes filled, not just with pain, but with the exhaustion of someone who carried too much for too long. He stared at her with a longing to fix what he had broken, but knowing that some wounds aren't healed by apologies alone. The room felt chilled by the quiet that followed, heavy with the realization that this confrontation had changed everything. And as she gently lifted her son into her arms, the distance between them felt both heartbreaking and necessary. The house felt quieter the next morning, as if the walls themselves were trying to soothe the ache left behind by the night before. He arrived early, unsure whether he would be welcome, but knowing he couldn't walk away again. She opened the door slowly, exhaustion softening her features, while the boy peeked around her leg with a hopeful curiosity. Daniel stepped inside with a cautious breath, expecting distance, but instead found a silence that felt more like uncertainty than anger. The boy tugged gently at his mother's sleeve, sensing her hesitation and his fear, and in that tiny moment the heavy tension softened just enough for them to breathe. She didn't smile, but she didn't close the door on him either. For the first time, he realized that the smallest gestures from her child were guiding them toward a place neither adult knew how to reach alone. Mateo tugged Daniel toward the living room with the natural ease only a child could carry, and the simple act disarmed the weight of the previous night. Elena watched them carefully, unsure how to feel as the man who once broke her heart now knelt beside her son with gentle patience. Daniel helped him stack toy blocks, each small gesture laced with unspoken remorse and a quiet desire to build something real. She leaned against the counter, torn between fear and the fragile hope rising in her chest. Seeing them together made her realize how much her son longed for connection, and how deeply Daniel regretted every year he missed. But regret alone didn't erase the past, and she knew the next steps would not be simple. Still, for a brief moment, watching the two of them together softened the sharp edges of her doubt. As the morning unfolded, the boy's laughter filled the room with a warmth that neither adult had felt in years. Daniel found himself smiling, despite the tightness in his chest, realizing how easily the child accepted him without the weight of history. Elena watched every interaction, noticing how Daniel's posture softened, how his voice lowered with genuine care, how he seemed terrified of doing anything wrong. The boy showed him drawings, proudly explaining each one with enthusiasm, and Daniel listened like every detail mattered. She felt her heart stir with emotions she wasn't ready to name, torn between the memory of who he was and the man kneeling before her child now. For the first time since his return, the possibility of something better didn't feel impossible, just frightening. When Daniel stood and thanked Mateo for showing him his artwork, the boy reached out and took his hand with a confidence that caught both adults off guard. Elena felt her breath hitch, watching her son cling to someone who had once disappeared so easily. Daniel froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the small gesture, as if holding the boy's hand carried the weight of every promise he had failed to keep. The connection between them was undeniable, fragile yet hopeful, and Elena wasn't sure whether it soothed her heart or scared her more. She saw something in Daniel's eyes, a mixture of longing and fear, revealing he understood how much this moment mattered. And when Matteo pulled him toward the couch to keep playing, she realized this was the beginning of a choice that would shape all their lives. As the morning settled into a quiet calm, she approached Daniel with a steadiness she didn't feel, knowing they couldn't keep pretending the past no longer mattered. He stood slowly, meeting her gaze with the humility of someone trying to rebuild trust one breath at a time. Matteo watched from the couch, clutching a toy, and sensing something important in the air. She told Daniel that rebuilding anything, even the smallest connection, would require effort, honesty, and the patience to earn back what was lost. He agreed without hesitation, knowing this was the first real chance he had been given. The room fell still, caught between sorrow and possibility, and for the first time she saw not the man who left her, but the man who might finally stay. And as Matteo ran toward them with open arms, the fragile hope that filled the room felt almost strong enough to hold. The afternoon drifted in with a quiet softness, but beneath it lay a tension both adults felt settling into their bones. Daniel stayed close, helping where he could, but every movement carried the weight of someone trying not to break what was already fragile. Elena watched him carefully, unsure whether she could trust the change she saw in him, or if it was just another moment that might fade like before. Matteo moved between them with the ease of a child who believed everyone he loved would stay, unaware of the fragile threads holding the adults together. As Elena reached for a stack of dishes, Daniel stepped in to help, their hands brushing lightly, a moment so small yet charged with years of unspoken emotion. She pulled back instinctively, not out of anger, but out of fear of believing in him again. And in that brief silence, he realized the choice before him wasn't about what he felt, but about proving, through actions alone, that he wouldn't run again. Daniel followed her to the living room as she gathered scattered toys, careful not to push further than she allowed. He noticed the exhaustion in her movements, the silent strength she carried, and wondered how she had managed all these years without breaking. She kept her focus on the toys in front of her, avoiding his gaze as she asked softly why he came back now, after everything had changed. He swallowed hard, realizing this was the moment she needed honesty more than anything else. He told her he had spent years convincing himself she was better off without him, until he finally understood that running from guilt only created more of it. She paused, her breath catching at the sincerity in his voice, but she didn't let her guard fall yet. Matteo crawled onto the couch, listening with the curiosity of someone sensing the truth hiding beneath their words. She sat down slowly, her knees bending as though the weight of the conversation finally settled on her shoulders. Daniel lowered himself onto the opposite couch, giving her space while still staying close enough to show he wasn't leaving. Matteo climbed into her lap and rested his head against her chest, grounding her with the gentle comfort only a child could offer. She looked at Daniel with eyes filled with a mix of vulnerability and quiet determination, reminding him how trust is rebuilt, not with promises, but with presence. He leaned forward, speaking softly, telling her he wasn't asking for forgiveness, just the chance to show he meant his words this time. She listened, her breath unsteady, trying to believe what she heard while protecting herself from hope that once betrayed her. And in the stillness between them, the possibility of something new began to take shape. The conversation deepened as she revealed the fears she never voiced, the fear of trusting someone who left, the fear of letting her son grow attached to a man who might walk away again, the fear of losing the small piece she fought to build. Daniel absorbed every word with a heavy but steady heart, realizing the depth of the wounds he never saw. Matteo looked between them innocently, his small hands resting on his mother's arm as if reminding her she wasn't alone. Daniel promised he would show up this time, not because he felt obligated, but because he genuinely wanted to be part of their lives. She heard the sincerity, But sincerity wasn't enough. Not anymore. Her silence told him that words alone wouldn't earn a place in their world. He would have to prove it one day at a time. As the conversation reached its quiet end, she finally looked at him with a softness he hadn't seen in years. Not forgiveness, but the beginning of understanding. He felt a fragile relief wash over him, knowing the path ahead would be slow. But at least it existed. Mateo slid off her lap and walked over to Daniel, placing a tiny hand on his knee as if making a decision for both adults. Daniel smiled gently, overwhelmed by the small gesture of trust. Elena watched the moment with a mixture of fear and cautious hope, realizing her son saw something in Daniel that she was trying to rediscover. The room settled into a peaceful hush, the kind that follows a storm but still holds the scent of rain. And in that quiet they understood that the next chapter wouldn't come from what had been said, but from what they were all willing to do next. Morning light slipped gently through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the room as if the world itself wanted to give them a fresh beginning. Daniel sat quietly at the edge of the couch, unsure of how close he was allowed to be, while Elena prepared breakfast with a calm that felt fragile but real. Mateo bounced between them with the joy only a child could carry, unaware of the emotional battle still lingering beneath the surface. Elena stole a glance at Daniel, noticing how carefully he watched her, how he moved slowly, as though afraid of breaking the peace. She felt something inside her shift, a quiet acceptance that maybe healing didn't have to be rushed. Maybe trust could rebuild in small, gentle steps. And as the boy tugged both adults toward the table, she realized the choice she had to make wasn't about the past anymore, but about the life she wanted her son to grow in. Breakfast carried a softness that felt unfamiliar but welcome. Mateo talked endlessly, sharing stories and little moments from his week, filling the room with laughter that loosened the tension lingering between the adults. Daniel responded with gentle attention, careful not to intrude, but wanting to show he was present in every way he could be. Elena watched the scene with a steadiness she hadn't felt before, noticing how her son looked at Daniel like someone who was already part of his world. The realization brought fear, but also a warmth she hadn't expected. She understood that whatever future they built would require more than forgiveness. It would require courage. And as she set down her cup and met Daniel's eyes, she saw that he was ready to carry his share of the weight at last. After breakfast, the three moved into the living room where sunlight pooled across the floor like a quiet blessing. Daniel helped Mateo build a tall block tower, each piece placed with gentle care, as if he were rebuilding more than just a toy structure. Elena sat nearby, observing the growing bond with a heart that wavered between fear and hope. She recognized something in Daniel's face, a sincerity she once believed in, but hadn't seen in years. When the tower finally stood tall and Mateo clapped in triumph, Daniel looked at Elena with a smile that spoke without words. It said he wanted to stay. It said he wasn't running. And for the first time, she felt the possibility of trusting him again begin to bloom softly inside her. Eventually, the boy curled up for an afternoon nap, leaving the adults alone in a silence that carried the weight of everything they hadn't said. Elena sat at the dining table, her fingers lightly tracing the wood grain as Daniel approached with cautious steps. She told him she wasn't ready to forget the past, but she was willing to try moving forward if he truly meant to stay. Her voice shook with honesty, and he felt the depth of her trust in every word she allowed herself to speak. He didn't interrupt. He didn't promise perfection. He simply told her he would show up, day after day, moment after moment, not with grand gestures, but with presence. She studied him for a long, quiet breath, searching for the man she once knew and the one he was becoming now. And slowly, she nodded, allowing the first real piece of healing to settle between them. As the sun dipped low and the day settled into a gentle calm, Daniel prepared to leave, knowing their journey was just beginning. Elena walked him to the door, her expression calm but layered with emotions she no longer tried to hide. Mateo woke just in time to run toward Daniel, wrapping small arms around his leg with the pure affection only a child could give. The moment hit Daniel harder than he expected, grounding him with a truth that echoed through his chest. He wanted to be part of this family, not to replace anything but to stand beside them. Elena watched the scene with eyes softening, realizing that healing didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in tiny, steady steps. When Daniel finally stepped back and promised he'd return the next day, she believed him. And as the door closed behind him, the quiet in the room felt different. Not empty, but full of something new. Hope.